It always began with a sound, not of thunder, but of steel, a hum that trembled through the carrier's decks long before dawn, when the sea was still black and the air tasted of salt and gasoline. It was the sound of engines warming beneath canvas tarps, of wrenches tapping bolts, of men moving carefully in red light. Out there on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, the world's most famous flat top, another day of war was waking. The Pacific stretched out in every direction, endless and indifferent. The war had gone on so long that the ocean itself seemed to have moods, one day gentle and blue, the next grey and cruel. That morning it was calm, almost too calm, as if waiting. The carrier's deck crews worked in silence, their boots echoing on steel, their faces pale beneath their helmets. They had performed this ritual hundreds of times, but routine never softened the edge of fear. They called the Avengers turkeys, big heavy bombers that looked awkward on the ground and indestructible in the air. Each one carried a torpedo slung beneath its belly, painted dull grey, a single weapon capable of gutting a cruiser if it hit just right. The men who flew them knew that just right almost never happened. Lieutenant Junior Grade Howard Murphy was one of those men. He was 26 years old and looked younger, a quiet pilot from Ohio who had joined the Navy before the war because he loved the smell of engines and the idea of flight. By 1944 he had flown more missions than he cared to count, and he wore that fatigue in the corners of his eyes. He wasn't famous, he wasn't reckless. He was simply good at what he did. At 0400 the loudspeakers cracked alive with a single word: flight quarters. The deck lit up like a stage, pilots climbed ladders, mechanics rolled out bombs, and the catwalks filled with the smell of oil and coffee. Murphy walked to his Avenger, bureau number 46712, running one gloved hand along the fuselage as if greeting an old friend. His turret gunner, Petty Officer James Landon, was already inside, humming a song that had no beginning or end. The radio man, Tom Fisher, crouched beside a tangle of cables, checking the radar set that always seemed to work best when least expected. The mission briefing had been short. Japanese surface forces had been sighted north of Sama, moving east through the Philippine Sea. The orders were simple: locate, identify, attack. It sounded routine on paper, nothing ever was. As dawn came, a faint band of silver split the horizon. The ocean turned from black to lead, from lead to blue. Steam hissed from catapults. The flight deck officer raised his signal paddle. Murphy eased the throttle forward. The Avenger's engine roared, shaking the entire ship. Then the deck rushed beneath him and fell away. The Enterprise shrank behind them, a dark island surrounded by white wakes. Ahead lay nothing but horizon. They joined formation with other Avengers, climbing to 3,000 feet, the sun a pale coin above the clouds. The radio was filled with routine chatter, bearings, altitudes, reports of scattered clouds. Underneath the noise was something no one said aloud, that the enemy was coming back strong. In the weeks leading up to Leyte Gulf, everyone aboard the Enterprise had sensed it. The Japanese Navy, thought to be broken, had suddenly moved again. Battleships long hidden in home waters were steaming south. The American invasion of the Philippines had triggered what Tokyo called Shogo Operation 1, the decisive battle to end the war. For the men of Task Force 38, it meant that somewhere beyond that horizon, the largest armada Japan had left was waiting. The sky turned hazy by mid-morning. Tropical storms brewed quickly here, rolling out of nowhere and swallowing fleets whole. Murphy flew on, eyes flicking from compass to altimeter. The Avenger vibrated steadily, the hum deepening with altitude. Fisher tapped his headset. "Skipper, getting faint returns at 175, big ones." Murphy's voice stayed even. "Range?" 20 miles, maybe a little more." They dropped to 500 feet, the sea a mirror below them. The haze thickened into mist, then opened like a curtain. And there they were, ships, dozens of them, grey, deliberate, moving in perfect formation. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers. Their wakes stretched like scars across the sea. The lead ship towered above the rest, 3 great turrets forward, 1 aft, the unmistakable outline of a Congo-class battleship. Murphy's stomach tightened. They had found the Japanese center force. He keyed the radio. "Enterprise Group Avenger 6-1. Contact. Bearing 175, range 18. Multiple heavies. Repeat, multiple heavies." Static answered. Clouds, distance, and interference chewed the words to pieces. He tried again. Nothing. When he looked around, the other Avengers were gone. The formation had dissolved in the mist. For a few seconds he hovered between fear and reason. He could turn back, re-establish contact, return with coordinates. That was what training dictated. But training didn't account for instinct, or for what he saw next. The battleships were changing course, turning south, directly toward the invasion beaches at Leyte. Thousands of soldiers were down there, unloading supplies, building airstrips completely exposed. If the Japanese broke through, it would be a slaughter. Murphy lowered the nose, scanning the fleet again. He could see men on the decks now, anti-aircraft crews running to their guns. He could see the flashes of rangefinders glinting like mirrors. He thought of the men on the beaches, the transports, the nurses waiting offshore. He thought of the friends buried on other islands, of the months of blood that had brought them here. Then he thought of nothing at all. He spoke into the intercom quietly. "We're going in!" Landon swore softly. Fisher didn't speak. He only adjusted the dials and muttered, "Roger that." Murphy shoved the throttle forward. The Avenger dropped to sea level, waves skimming under its belly. The horizon grew large, the fleet enormous. The first flak bursts appeared almost immediately. Black blossoms in the air, deliberate and precise. The Avenger rattled like a drum, metal pinged against the fuselage. A shell burst close enough to flash white across the cockpit. The right wing shuddered. Gauges flickered. Murphy steadied the controls. The torpedo arm light glowed green. "Hold on," he said. He lined up the lead ship, the Congo class, watching its bow angle through his sights. 2,000 yards and 1,500, 1,000. The altimeter barely moved. He released at 800 yards. The torpedo splashed free, white wake cutting across the grey sea. Murphy hauled the stick left, climbing through smoke. The gunners below opened up, tracing his flight path with streams of red. Behind him, a single bloom of fire lifted from the battleship's stern. Then another. The ship lurched, smoke pouring from its starboard quarter. Men ran, tiny figures swallowed by flame. Fisher's voice cracked with disbelief. "Hit! Skipper, we hit her!" Murphy didn't answer. The plane was climbing, straining, the engine coughing smoke. Another shell burst beneath them. The Avenger lurched sideways. Oil splattered the windshield. "Pressure dropping," Fisher called. "We're leaking bad." Murphy steadied the yoke, searching for sky. "Tell the ship we got one," he said softly. "Tell them," the radio hissed. Words faded into static. At 0724, radar on the Enterprise picked up a single return disappearing north of the Japanese fleet. Then nothing. On the sea below, the battleship burned until noon, rolling slowly onto her side. Survivors clung to wreckage, staring at the empty horizon, where a lone aircraft had come from nowhere and vanished. No one believed one torpedo could have done it. Some swore they'd seen 3 planes. Others said it must have been a submarine. But the water was too shallow, and no submarine ever claimed the kill. The Japanese logged the loss simply as severe damage from unknown attack. The Americans marked Murphy's Avenger as overdue. Both sides would spend years trying to fill in the silence that lay between those two facts. By nightfall, the sea had taken both ship and plane. The fire faded to smoke, and the smoke to mist, and the mist to nothing at all. And yet somewhere in that quiet, something lingered. The echo of an engine, the hum that had started everything. The sun never truly rises on a battlefield at sea. It just burns through the smoke. By mid-morning, the Pacific around Sama looked like an iron-grey mirror shattered by drifting oil fires. The Japanese center force had slowed uneasy. A single battleship, once proud, now wounded, trailed smoke so thick that other ships vanished inside it. On her bridge, officers argued over charts. The gunnery captain insisted that they had been struck by a mine. The navigator swore he had seen an aircraft diving low across the waves. The commanding officer listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the attacker had come from. "One plane cannot do this," he said finally. No one answered. Pride was easier to cling to than truth. Below decks, the damaged crews fought against the inevitable. Compartments filled faster than they could pump them out. Fires burned in the stern where the torpedo had struck, eating through decks still hot from the boilers. The list increased with every passing minute. The men worked barefoot in a waist-deep water, shouting over the roar of the ship's death throes. When the angle grew too steep, the captain gave the only order left, abandon ship. Some refused. They stayed at their guns even as the deck tilted beneath them, firing at ghosts on the horizon. For them, the shame of leaving outweighed the fear of drowning. Others jumped into the sea and clung to floating debris, coughing up oil and disbelief. None could understand how a single enemy aircraft had found them in such emptiness. By noon the ship was gone. Only an oil slick remained, stretching for miles across the sea like a wound. The survivors drifted silently. Far off, the rest of the fleet resumed its course south, leaving them behind to the current. That evening, aboard the Enterprise, the horizon glowed faintly where the wreck still burned. Radar screens showed no friendly contacts in that direction. The flight controller checked his log again, then again, refusing to write the word missing. On the ready room chalkboard, the name Murphy, Avenger 6-1, stayed circled, a question mark drawn beside it. The ship's loudspeakers played nothing but static. Men waited for a call sign that never came. At last, the operations officer gave a weary nod, and someone rang a single bell on the bridge. One tone, no speech, no ceremony. The sound carried across the dark deck and vanished into the wind. That night few slept. The mechanics sat by their benches, hands idle, watching the empty elevator where Murphy's aircraft should have returned. Pilots replayed the morning in their heads, the takeoff, the heading, the weather closing in. Every man convinced himself that there had been a mistake, that the Avenger would appear at dawn trailing smoke but alive. Hope is stubborn aboard a carrier. At first light, the Enterprise launched a search. Hellcats fanned north and west, flying low over slicks of oil that shone like mercury. They found fragments of wood, a torn life jacket, part of a wing marked with the faded white star of the Navy, nothing more. After 6 hours, the search was called off. The Pacific had drawn its curtain. News of the attack filtered slowly through the task force. A Japanese battleship confirmed sunk. No one could say by whom. The coordinates matched Murphy's last report. On the bridge, the captain of the Enterprise read the dispatch twice before speaking. "Then he did it," he said quietly. "One of ours." The story spread in fragments. On destroyers escorting the carrier, sailors repeated it as rumour. A lone Avenger charging through flak, a torpedo striking true, a ship disappearing beneath the sea. Some believed it, some didn't, but by the time the fleet reached Ulithi Atoll a week later, the tale had already taken on the shape of legend. Men began calling him the Ghost. In the following days the war ground on. New missions replaced the old, new targets replaced the ones already burning. The deck crews scrubbed away the oil stains and stenciled new serial numbers onto replacement aircraft. Yet every evening, just after sunset, someone would glance west and murmur, "He's still out there." Among the Japanese survivors rescued by passing destroyers, disbelief hardened into myth. They told their rescuers that the attack had come from nowhere, that the plane had appeared like a phantom out of the mist. One sailor claimed it never climbed after the strike, that it simply vanished into the horizon without sound. Another swore the pilot waved as he passed, a vision meant to haunt rather than kill. Their officers dismissed such talk, but the men kept telling it. In a war already thick with superstition, the ghost became one more shadow over the sea. Weeks later, Allied intelligence confirmed that a Congo-class battleship had indeed been lost north of Sama, its stern torn open by a single torpedo. The date matched Murphy's last transmission exactly. In the logbooks of the Enterprise, an asterisk appeared beside his name, followed by a single line in small print, "Presumed missing." Action effective. It was bureaucratic language for something far greater than paperwork. When the carrier returned to Pearl Harbor for overhaul, the chaplain held a brief service on the hangar deck. 3 helmets, 3 names, 3 folded flags. The crowd of sailors stood in silence as the wind from the open hangar doors pressed against their uniforms. The chaplain's words were simple. They went where duty called, and they did not return. No one needed more than that. Afterward, the men drifted back to their posts, but that night the mess hall was quieter than usual. Someone pinned a small photograph of Murphy beside the chart table, a candid shot taken months earlier on deck, goggles around his neck, a faint grin on his face. Underneath, a note written in pencil. 1 torpedo, 1 battleship. The ocean forgets most names quickly, but sometimes when the right story meets the right silence, it stays. For the crews of the Enterprise, that silence began on a calm morning over Samar and never really ended. The sky over Samar had turned the colour of gunmetal. Clouds pressed down like a lid, trapping smoke and light together, until the horizon disappeared. Out here, there was no up or down, only the sea and the heartbeat of an engine. In the cockpit of the Avenger, Howard Murphy's gloved hands rested steady on the yoke. The gauges trembled under vibration, oil temperature steady, fuel pressure good, altimeter barely a whisper above zero. The plane's engine drummed through his ribs like another pulse. They had been flying alone for nearly 40 minutes now. Every few minutes the radio man called out bearings. Every few seconds the gunner craned his neck, searching for shapes in the fog. There was no sound beyond the growl of the propeller and the wind clawing at the glass. When the first shells exploded ahead they looked almost beautiful. Black flowers blooming against grey. Then came the thunder. The sea leapt upward, hammered flat again. Murphy dropped lower, flying through the smoke. Spray lashed the windshield. Blurring the horizon, somewhere ahead, the Japanese guns walked their fire closer. It was like flying into a heartbeat gone mad. "Skipper! Tracer 2 o'clock!" Landon's voice cut through the intercom. "I see it," Murphy answered. He banked left, then right, dancing just above the waves. The Avenger was heavy, but at this speed it felt almost alive. Every gust of wind, every jolt of flak sent it sliding sideways like a prizefighter dodging blows. Through the gun sight the battleship swelled. Grey towers, decks lined with guns, the red sun flag snapping in the wind. He steadied his breath. A torpedo run was mathematics mixed with faith. The numbers never worked perfectly. You had to feel the timing. Drop too early and the weapon would bounce, drop too late and the explosion would take you with it. The manuals didn't say that part. The Japanese gunners had him bracketed now. Shells burst ahead and behind, the air a wall of heat and shrapnel. He saw fragments spin past the canopy like sparks. One hit the wing root, punching a thumb-sized tarred hole that glowed orange at the edges. Another tore through the rudder. The plane staggered, then caught itself. "We're fine," he lied. At 8,000 yards he began the final approach. Landon's turret barked short bursts, tracers flashing back toward the grey line of ships. The radio hissed with Fisher's voice, clipped and calm. "Speed 180, altitude 50, ready on your mark." Murphy's mind slowed. The noise around him faded until there was only the hum and the smell of burning cordite. He remembered the Ohio fields where he had learned to fly, the way the wind had moved through the wheat the first time his instructor let him take the stick alone. The sky had felt infinite then. It still did, even here, even with death waiting ahead. 2,000 yards. He levelled out. The deck of the battleship filled his view, men running, gun barrels tracking, water geysers rising. He could see faces now, tiny dots moving against steel. He imagined they could see his too. For a strange, still instant there was no hatred, only recognition. Two sets of men caught in the same war, both doing what they were told. "Mark!" Fisher shouted. Murphy thumbed the release. The plane lurched upward as the torpedo fell away, a grey cylinder slicing into the sea. A clean entry, no bounce. He banked left hard, pushing the engine past its limits. The altimeter spun upward, 70 feet, 100, 200. Smoke clawed at the tail. The air shimmered with heat and lead. Then the world behind him exploded. A single blinding flash. The torpedo hit dead aft, just beneath the waterline. A column of flame rose higher than the ship's masts, then bent sideways with the wind. The shockwave slapped the Avenger like a hand. Instruments jumped. Fisher yelled something lost in static. Landon screamed through the turret mic, "You got her! Jesus, you hit her!" Murphy didn't look back. He climbed through smoke thick as tar, every nerve screaming. He could feel the plane fighting him now, controls heavy, the engine coughing. Oil splattered across the windshield, streaking the sunlight into ribbons. "Hold together," he whispered. A shell burst close off the left wing. Fragments tore through the fuselage, one ripping across Landon's shoulder. The gunner's breathing filled the intercom shallow, fast. "I'm hit, Skipper. Hang in there." "We're almost through." Fisher's voice wavered. Oil pressure 0, temps climbing. Murphy kept climbing. The horizon was a smudge of gold above the smoke. He thought if he could just reach that light, they'd make it home. But the Avenger began to shudder violently. The propeller slowed. Black smoke poured from the engine cowling. The cockpit filled with the acrid smell of burning oil. Fisher coughed, choking on fumes. The gauges danced wildly, then fell to zero one by one. Murphy eased back on the throttle. The engine died with a final groan. Silence rushed in, a heavy, suffocating silence broken only by the wind and the creak of metal cooling. They were gliding now, barely holding altitude. Below, the sea stretched endless and empty. No land, no ships, only the wreckage of the battleship smouldering behind them. "Skipper," Fisher said quietly, "we're not going to make it, are we?" Murphy didn't answer. He levelled the wings and watched the sun cut a pale line across the clouds. "Radio the ship," he said finally. "Tell them we got one." Fisher switched frequencies, voice steady despite the smoke. "Enterprise, this is Avenger 6-1. Torpedo hit confirmed. Enemy battleship burning. We got one." Static swallowed the rest. Murphy smiled faintly. "Good work." He adjusted the trim, holding the plane steady for as long as it would listen. Behind him, the water glimmered like glass, each wave catching the dying sunlight. The Avenger sank lower, slower, its shadow brushing the surface, and Landon's breathing slowed. Fisher said something, maybe a prayer, maybe a curse, but the words were lost to wind. The ocean rose to meet them, gentle, inevitable. From the Japanese fleet, lookouts reported a single aircraft trailing smoke, vanishing into the clouds. Some swore it disintegrated mid-air. Others claimed it levelled off and disappeared into the sun. No wreckage was ever found. For hours afterward, the battleship burned, her stern twisted open like a wound. Secondary explosions lit the dusk. The sea around her shimmered with oil and debris. By midnight, she was gone. The surviving ships turned north again, shaken. No one spoke of it. Pride and disbelief made uneasy companions. To the men aboard the Enterprise, the coordinates came through just before nightfall. A single message, broken by static. "Enemy battleship hit, plane failing. Tell them we got one." Then silence. The radio operator stared at the headset, hoping for another syllable. None came. Somewhere out there, a plane had fallen silent, but it had taken a giant with it. The fleet recorded the coordinates, then the time, 0724 hours, a mark on paper that meant everything and nothing at once. On the sea, the wind carried the smell of burning oil across miles of water, and for the first time in the war, Japanese sailors spoke of an American ghost, one that came out of the mist, struck once, and vanished. A ghost with wings. When morning came again, the sea looked deceptively calm. The storm haze had lifted, the surface shone like glass, but under that fragile mirror lay a graveyard, the shattered hull of a battleship, the scattered wreck of a plane, and the silence that follows impossible events. Aboard the Japanese flagship Yamato, reports arrived in fragments, each one more confusing than the last. At first, they believed the lost vessel had struck a mine. Then the survivors rescued by destroyers spoke of an aircraft, one plane, flying low, appearing out of nowhere. The officers dismissed it. "A single torpedo cannot destroy a battleship," one said. "It is unscientific." Yet the photographs taken from reconnaissance seaplanes left no doubt. The stern had been blown open, the propeller shafts twisted like corkscrews. In Tokyo, the news was treated with disbelief. The Admiralty censored the details before forwarding them to the press. The official communique spoke only of an unfortunate accident during fleet manoeuvres. But the sailors who had been there whispered a different story, a ghost story. They called the attacker Kiseki no Hikoki, the miracle plane. For days afterward, ships passing through the area reported strange phenomena. Radar echoes with no source, phantom engine noises carried on the wind. The sea has always been a breeding ground for superstition, and war feeds it well. The Japanese crews, already weary and hollowed by years of defeat, began to fear the unseen as much as the visible. In wardrooms and bunks, men spoke of an American spirit that haunted the waters of Sama, a lone aviator who refused to die until his enemy's fleet was gone. Thousands of miles away on the USS Enterprise, the legend was forming in a different way. It started small, just a line in the operations log, a date, and the words "no further contact." But rumours move faster than paper. By the time the carrier reached Ulithi, the story had already spread through half the Pacific. One Avenger against a battleship, one torpedo that sank a giant. The pilots in the ready room told it between missions, embellishing the details each time. Some said Murphy dove through a wall of fire. Others claimed he radioed a final message that ended with laughter. The truth mattered less than what it represented, the idea that courage could still bend the odds. In a war of machines and strategies, it reminded men that willpower still counted. The Enterprise's captain understood this. When a correspondent asked him whether the story was true, he only said, "It ought to be." That was enough. Back in the United States, letters from the fleet trickled home. In Ohio, Murphy's parents received an official telegram first, "Missing in action." Weeks later came a letter from one of his squadron mates, written in cramped pencil lines. It told of a mission, a sighting, and a radio call that ended with the words, "We got one." The letter closed with a single sentence. "He gave us a reason to believe again." They kept it folded inside a family Bible for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, the war surged onward. The Enterprise fought through Iwo Jima and Okinawa, her decks scarred but unbroken. Each time the ship went into battle, someone chalked a small ghostly outline on the hangar bulkhead, a plane with wings outstretched diving into the sea. After each mission they wiped it clean and drew it again. A quiet ritual no one ever explained. Among Japanese sailors, the same story took a darker turn. Survivors spoke of hearing engines in their sleep, of seeing a lone plane skimming the waves before dawn. Some believed it was a warning, others believed it was vengeance. Either way, it lived in their minds long after the warships had rusted away. At night in the Pacific, where the wind moves like a memory, men on both sides began to speak of the same thing. A single sound that came before dawn, a faint hum like the start of an engine. Those who heard it swore the air grew colder, the sea quieter. No one ever found the source. Maybe it was imagination, maybe not. But the legend of the ghost from the Enterprise had crossed from history into something older, something the ocean itself seemed to remember. By early 1945, even the intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor had heard the rumors. One analyst, curious, tried to trace the story through operational records. He found the coordinates of the attack, matched them to Japanese loss reports, and concluded that the target had been the Haruna, one of the 4 Congo-class battleships. The official loss date didn't line up. The Japanese had changed it later to hide the embarrassment. The analyst wrote in the margin, "Confirmed probable, 1 Avenger, 1 hit, 1 kill," then he underlined it twice. When the war finally ended, the Enterprise steamed home under a grey sky. Her decks were pitted, her planes worn, but she carried more ghosts than crew now. As the ship approached the Golden Gate, a photographer captured a single moment. Sailors lined along the railings, hats off, eyes on the horizon. Somewhere among them, perhaps, someone was thinking of a quiet pilot who had taken off one morning and never returned. In the years that followed, the story refused to fade. Journalists wrote about it, historians argued over it, veterans told it in bars. Some dismissed it as folklore, a morale myth born from exhaustion. Others insisted they had seen the explosion themselves, that no myth burns that bright. And then, one summer in 1956, a Japanese officer named Lieutenant Kurosawa visited an American Naval Museum in San Diego. He had served aboard a destroyer that day off Samar. When he saw the model of the Enterprise on display, he removed his cap and bowed. "There was a plane," he said through a translator. "One plane. It came from the clouds and struck true. We thought it was impossible." He paused, his eyes wet with memory. "Perhaps impossible things happen in war?" The curator asked him if he wanted to see the photographs of the Avenger pilots. Kurosawa nodded. When he saw Murphy's face, calm, young, ordinary and airy, he whispered something in Japanese that no one translated at the time. Later, the interpreter explained. He said, "That is the face I remember when I close my eyes. Time has a way of burying the truth, but the sea keeps a different kind of memory. It doesn't forget. It waits. 2 decades after the war, the Pacific was calm again. Merchant ships crossed the same routes where fleets once fought. Fishermen cast their nets over waters that had swallowed thousands of men. The sound of engines was no longer a signal of fear but of commerce. Yet beneath that tranquil surface, the ghosts of 1944 still lingered. In 1968, a Japanese survey vessel mapping the seafloor for mineral deposits passed over a region north of Sama. The sonar operator watched his screen as a strange shadow appeared, long, wide, with the unmistakable contour of a ship lying on its side. He adjusted the gain, tracing the outline. Bows, twisted, stern missing. "Battleship," he murmured. "Big one." The captain noted the coordinates but ordered silence. A Officially, no battleship had been lost there. The data was filed away and forgotten. But rumours surfaced quickly. Old sailors in Yokosuka whispered that one of the Congo sisters still slept out there, the one that the ghost plane had killed. When the Navy quietly confirmed that the hull likely belonged to Haruna, they released no statement. Pride, even in defeat, is a stubborn thing. Across the Pacific, an American historian named Walter Dyer spent his life chasing the story. He had served as a deckhand on the Enterprise during the war, a 19-year-old kid from Kansas who had watched the Avengers take off every morning. Murphy's last flight had burned into his memory, the way the plane vanished into the grey dawn, the silence that followed. After the war, Dyer studied history, collected logbooks, wrote letters to anyone who had been there. He wasn't after the glory, he wanted closure. He wanted to know where his friend had gone. By the 1970s, he had assembled a small team of oceanographers and veterans to locate the wrecks of Leyte Gulf. Using sonar borrowed from a research institute in Hawaii, they mapped miles of seafloor. On a humid day in 1977, their instruments picked up a massive silhouette at a depth of over 1,000 feet. It matched the Haruna's dimensions exactly. When they sent down cameras, the first image that returned was of a gun turret half buried in sand, coral growing from its barrels. The next showed a gaping hole near the stern, an entry wound unmistakably made by a torpedo. Dyer stared at the grainy screen for a long time before speaking. "That's it," he said softly. He did it. He requested permission from both governments to mark the site as a war grave. Japan agreed first. The United States followed, adding the wreck to its list of preserved naval heritage sites. For the first time in history, both sides acknowledged the same truth. A single torpedo from a single American aircraft had destroyed one of Japan's last battleships. The news made few headlines. The world had moved on to other wars, other frontiers, but for those who remembered, it was vindication. The Enterprise Association held a small ceremony on deck of the carrier midway. Veterans stood in a line, hats removed as a wreath was cast into the sea. No speeches, no cameras, just silence, and the low hum of engines beneath their feet. In Japan, the discovery stirred older men from their quiet retirements. Some had served aboard the lost battleship. One of them, a former engine room sailor named Hiroshi Tanaka, wrote a letter to the American embassy. It read, "I was 21 when the torpedo struck. I remember the sound. It was not loud. It was like a deep breath before dying. For years I blamed chance or the ocean. But now I know it was a man, alone flying toward us. I do not hate him. I think he was brave, perhaps braver than all of us together." The letter was forwarded to Dyer, who kept it framed above his desk until he died. As the decades passed, fewer veterans remained to tell the story. The Enterprise herself was decommissioned and scrapped, her steel melted down for civilian ships, but the legend of the ghost endured, passed quietly through squadrons of naval aviators who grew up hearing about a man who flew alone into the storm. In the 1990s, a documentary crew from the History Channel visited the site with a submersible. The cameras captured the wreck in haunting clarity. The bow broken, decks carpeted in coral. As their lights swept along the hull, they revealed the torn metal at the point of impact. The narrator's voice trembled as he read from the Enterprise's war diary. Avenger 6-1, bearing 175, torpedo released, enemy battleship hit, plane failing, tell them we got one. Viewers across the world heard those words and paused. Even in an age of satellites and missiles, the courage of one pilot still felt impossible. In 2004, divers placed a small bronze plaque near the breach in the hull. It read simply, "Here rests the Haruna. Sunk October 25, 1944, by a lone torpedo from the USS Enterprise. Courage is louder than thunder. No wreaths, no national flags, just that line." The ocean slowly claimed it, covering the plaque in algae, until it gleamed green in the light of the submersible's lamps. At the same time, a memorial service was held aboard the nuclear carrier Enterprise CVN-65, the 8th ship to bear the name. The captain read from an old letter written by a mechanic who had worked on Murphy's plane. It ended with these words, "I don't know what heaven looks like for pilots, but I hope it has a hangar, a deck, and a headwind, because if it does, he's already flying." When the crew of CVN-65 heard that, they stood in silence, hats removed, listening to the faint hum of the ship's reactors, the same kind of hum that once lived beneath the decks of the old Enterprise. For the Japanese, the legend took a gentler shape. Children's textbooks in some prefectures mention the ghost pilot of Sama, describing him not as an enemy, but as a symbol of resolve. Even the enemy had heroes, one teacher explained in an interview. That is how peace begins, when we admit bravery has no flag. Today, satellites can map the wreck's outline with perfect precision. You can see the torn stern, the jagged hole where the torpedo struck. Yet none of those images capture the moment itself, the courage, the noise, the heartbeat of a man choosing to dive when reason said climb. Machines can record the shape of a ship, but only stories can keep its spirit afloat. When Dyer's ashes were scattered over the same coordinates in 2009, a flight of FA-18 Hornets from the modern Enterprise passed overhead. They dipped their wings once, a gesture from a new generation to an old. Somewhere down below, the ghost slept on, wrapped in salt and silence, his story now part of both oceans, the one that separated enemies and the one that joined them.